She said she couldn't breathe, and I realized it was because I'd never been closer to her heart. The office was quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional clack of keyboards. I was used to the routine, my tasks, my deadlines, the predictable rhythm of midweek monotony. But that morning, everything felt slightly off-center. That was the first time I really noticed her, not just as my boss's wife, but as a person, someone with a presence that filled the room without demanding attention. She entered with the kind of effortless grace that made people take notice, though no one dared to stare too long. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor, a measured cadence that somehow echoed in my chest. She wore a blouse in a muted tone that complemented the warmth of her skin and a subtle fragrance, something floral, delicate, almost nostalgic, that lingered just long enough to catch my attention without being intrusive. I found myself wondering if she knew how magnetic she was, even in the simplest gestures. I had seen her in passing before, attending office events or stopping by for brief conversations, but today was different. She seemed softer somehow, or maybe just more real. A slight crease at the corner of her eyes when she smiled, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with casual grace. Even her laugh, a low and gentle sound, carried a warmth that made the cold office walls feel a little less sterile. Our first interaction was banal on the surface. She asked a question about a report, something I could answer quickly, but the way she leaned slightly over the desk, her fingers brushing mine as she pointed to a figure, sent a jolt I didn't expect. It was brief, almost imperceptible, yet it lingered. Her touch was light, casual, yet somehow grounding. I realized in that moment that the age difference between us wasn't just a number. It was a subtle undercurrent in the way she carried herself, the quiet assurance in her voice, the layers of experience beneath her composed exterior. I noticed the little details, the faint tension in her shoulders that hinted at worries she didn't voice, the slow, thoughtful way she spoke as if every word was measured but genuine. And then there were her eyes, so keen, so aware, holding a depth that made me feel simultaneously exposed and safe, like she could see the parts of me I usually kept hidden. I didn't speak of my fascination, of course. I simply observed, quietly admiring, storing away these fragments of her presence for moments when they might resurface in memory. That day, I became acutely aware of the invisible space between us. The years, the social boundaries, the unspoken rules. And yet, there was something electric in that distance, a subtle tension that promised more than casual acquaintance. Every glance, every incidental touch, every shared laugh was a thread, weaving a delicate connection neither of us could ignore. By the time she left, I was aware of one undeniable truth. Something had shifted. The office felt smaller, warmer, and more alive, as though her presence had imprinted itself on the air. I couldn't name it yet. Was it attraction, curiosity, admiration? But I knew one thing. My routine, my predictable life, had just been quietly, irrevocably disrupted. It was late afternoon when the office finally felt empty, the steady hum of computers fading into near silence. I had stayed behind to finish a report when I heard her voice, soft but carrying across the room. She sounded unsettled. I looked up and saw her standing by the window, one hand pressed lightly against the glass, the other cradling a folder as if it were fragile. Her expression was small, almost hesitant, and for the first time, I noticed a faint catch in her breath. It wasn't the kind of shortness you get from climbing stairs. It was something deeper, a momentary vulnerability that startled me. Without thinking, I stood and walked over, my shoes quiet on the polished floor, my pulse slightly quicker than usual. "Are you okay?" I asked, careful not to overstep. She met my gaze, and for a heartbeat, the world outside the window seemed to blur. Her eyes were warm, framed by faint lines that spoke of experience and quiet strength. There was a flicker of relief, barely perceptible, but there, before she let herself lean slightly toward me. I think I just need a moment," she said, voice almost a whisper. I nodded and stepped closer, keeping the space comfortable yet intentional. Her hand brushed mine as I guided the folder to her desk. The contact was fleeting, yet it carried an unspoken intimacy. I could feel the warmth of her skin, the slight tremor in her fingers, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat pressing through the thin fabric of her blouse. It was grounding, familiar, and electric all at once. I gestured toward her chair. "Sit for a moment," I suggested gently. She obeyed, letting out a quiet sigh as she sank into the seat. I noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the desk. Without overthinking it, I placed a hand lightly on her forearm, just enough to offer reassurance. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the contact, as if seeking steadiness in my presence. The room felt suspended in time. The usual barriers, titles, expectations, the years between us, melted in that quiet bubble. I could see the faint sheen of stress on her skin, the delicate curve of her wrist as she relaxed under the touch, the softness in her eyes that rarely appeared in public. And I realized something profound. This wasn't just a gesture of comfort for her. It was a bridge, a subtle acknowledgement that our connection was more than fleeting curiosity. We spoke softly, barely above a murmur, sharing thoughts that felt personal yet safe. She laughed lightly at something trivial in the report, a warm, genuine sound that made the tension in the room dissipate. And when her hand brushed mine again, accidental or not, it sent a quiet thrill through me. I wasn't supposed to feel this close to her. The age difference, the social boundaries, the office dynamics, they all screamed caution. And yet, in that moment, nothing else mattered but the simple act of being near her, the quiet intimacy of shared space and unspoken understanding. By the time she left that afternoon, a subtle change had settled over us. There was a new awareness, a gentle tension that hummed beneath the surface, soft but unmistakable. I returned to my desk, my fingers lingering on the spot where her hand had brushed mine, and understood something I couldn't yet name. The first thread of something extraordinary had been woven between us. The following week, the office carried the usual hum of routine, but between us, something had shifted. It was in the way she greeted me, just slightly warmer, her eyes holding a fraction longer than necessary. I noticed the softness in her expression, the quiet openness that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, imperceptible to anyone else, but to me, it was a world of difference. The moment came unexpectedly. I was helping her organize some files in her home office, an arrangement we had agreed on after hours, under the guise of efficiency. She moved around the room with her characteristic poise, yet there was a hesitation in her movements, a vulnerability that betrayed the confident exterior she showed to the world. I reached to hand her a folder, and our fingers brushed. The contact lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I felt her inhale softly, almost imperceptibly. It was a small, intimate gesture, yet it carried an unspoken acknowledgement, an understanding that we were both aware of the tension building between us. She paused, leaning against the desk, and for a moment, I saw her not as the graceful, composed woman everyone admired, but as someone human, delicate, and quietly burdened. "Sometimes," she said, her voice low and tentative, "I wonder if I've made the right choices, if I'm living the life I imagined." Her words were simple, but they struck me with surprising intensity. It wasn't just the confession, it was the trust she placed in me, the willingness to reveal a hidden piece of herself. I noticed how her hand unconsciously found my arm, a fleeting touch that conveyed both need and reassurance. Her skin was warm, soft under my fingers, and the subtle pressure of her grip made my chest tighten. I wanted to say something that would make her feel understood, something honest and grounded. Instead, I let my presence speak, standing beside her, offering silent steadiness. Her gaze met mine, and in that look, I sensed gratitude, a quiet relief that someone finally saw her fully, not just the poised exterior, but the person beneath. The conversation unfolded slowly, naturally. She spoke of past regrets, fleeting joys, and moments of loneliness that no one else knew. I listened, responding with gentle questions, small affirmations, and the occasional warm smile. Every gesture, every pause, every glance built a bridge between us, a delicate thread of trust, and intimacy that neither of us could ignore. Even in silence, there was communication. The way she shifted closer while examining a document, the light touch of her hand as she reached for a pen, the slight leaning in when she laughed softly at a private joke. It all spoke of connection, subtle but electric. I felt the pull of her presence, the quiet weight of her experience, and the gentle thrill of being seen in a way I hadn't been before. By the time I left that evening, the space between us had grown smaller, not physically, but emotionally. The layers beneath her composed exterior were now visible to me, and I realized something profound. The age gap, the social boundaries, and the office hierarchy faded in the face of genuine connection. We weren't just drawn to each other. We were slowly, irreversibly entwined in the quiet intimacy of understanding, trust, and unspoken desire. The days that followed felt charged with a quiet electricity. Every glance, every shared workspace, carried the unspoken awareness of what had passed between us. It wasn't overt, and no one else would have noticed, but for me, every gesture, every accidental touch, was amplified. The age difference, the social expectations, the professional boundaries, none of that seemed to matter when we were near each other, yet it also made every interaction weighty, fragile, and thrilling. One afternoon, she called me to her office to review some contracts. The space was small, quiet, and dimly lit by the afternoon sun spilling through the blinds. As I handed her the papers, our fingers brushed again, lightly, almost apologetically, but this time, it lingered a fraction longer. I felt a small jolt run through me, a mix of warmth, anticipation, and the sharp awareness of restraint. She didn't pull away. Instead, she shifted slightly closer, just enough that the warmth of her shoulder pressed subtly against mine. There was a rhythm to these moments, a silent push-pull that neither of us could fully control. I would lean in to explain something, and she would tilt her head, listening, letting the space between us shrink without breaking any rules. Our conversations became layered, a surface of work-related discussion, underneath a current of shared glances, small smiles, and the unspoken acknowledgement of closeness. The tension wasn't just physical. It was in the way she laughed softly at a private joke, in the way her fingers hovered near mine when passing documents, in the subtle tilt of her head when she asked a question. Each gesture was carefully balanced, expressive enough to convey interest, restrained enough to honor propriety. And yet, for all the caution, there was a magnetic pull between us, a quiet intimacy that made the air feel warmer, heavier, charged with possibility. I noticed the small details that made her human and approachable. The faint crease on her forehead when concentrating, the nervous bite of her lower lip when she hesitated, the tiny shrug of her shoulders when unsure. And yet, even in these moments of vulnerability, there was an undeniable strength, an experience that the years had honed, a calm confidence that drew me in irresistibly. The contrast was intoxicating. The vulnerability made her approachable, the strength made her magnetic. One particularly charged moment came as we were both reaching for the same folder. Our hands touched, palms brushing against each other with the lightest pressure. I caught the way she inhaled softly, the subtle quickening of her pulse visible in her wrist. For a moment, the office seemed to vanish. There was only the shared tension, the silent acknowledgement of what neither of us dared to voice. By the time I left her office that day, my thoughts were consumed with the memory of her presence. Each interaction left a lingering warmth, a quiet ache, a desire for closeness that I both cherished and feared. The push-pull was maddeningly sweet, the restraint making every fleeting touch, every glance, feel monumental. In that silent tension, I realized the story between us was no longer just professional. It had grown into something deeper, something delicate yet undeniable, poised on the edge of desire and propriety. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more magnetic it became. Each subtle brush and lingering look a promise of what might come, if we dared to cross the invisible line. It was one of those rare evenings when the office was nearly empty, the world outside dimming into twilight. The golden light filtered through the blinds, painting the room in warm amber hues. I was finishing up some paperwork when she appeared at the door, casual yet deliberate, carrying a folder and a faintly tired expression. Her presence immediately shifted the air. Even the quiet hum of the computers seemed to soften in anticipation. "Do you have a minute?" she asked, voice low, almost hesitant. There was something in her tone, a quiet urgency that I couldn't ignore. I nodded, gesturing toward the chairs near the window. She moved closer, and as she sat, I noticed the subtle hitch in her breath, a shallow inhale that made her vulnerability almost tangible. I can't breathe," she said suddenly, her words soft, almost embarrassed, as if admitting a small weakness. For a moment, I was caught off guard. Her eyes met mine, a flicker of vulnerability mixed with something playful, something daring. I leaned just slightly toward her, careful not to overstep, letting my presence be a steady anchor. "That's because you're closer than ever," I replied, my voice gentle, calm, but carrying an unspoken weight. Her lips curved into a small, amused smile, but the warmth in her gaze betrayed her calm exterior. She shifted, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, and I felt the faint heat of her hand as it lingered on the edge of the folder. There was a charged pause, a moment suspended between us where the world seemed to narrow down to the space we occupied, the subtle rhythm of our breathing, the warmth of our closeness. Our conversation that evening was soft, intimate, and deliberate. She shared small worries, tiny frustrations, and fleeting fears, things she hadn't voiced before. Every word was accompanied by subtle gestures, a hand resting lightly on mine, a lean toward me while emphasizing a point, the faint tremor in her shoulder when she laughed at her own self-deprecation. Each movement, each glance, was a brushstroke painting the depth of her trust in me. There was a playful tension in her eyes, a magnetic pull that made it impossible to break away. Our hands met occasionally, fingers brushing, lingering just long enough to create a current of warmth. The air between us felt alive, every subtle touch carrying the weight of emotions we had both tried to suppress. And yet, there was no rush, no pressure. Only the quiet understanding that we had crossed a line, but one drawn in mutual respect and emotional honesty. When the moment ended and she rose to leave, the space between us seemed heavier, imbued with the memory of closeness and the electricity of unspoken desire. Her gaze lingered a fraction longer than necessary, her fingers lightly grazing mine in farewell. I watched her go, aware of a warmth that settled deep in my chest, a quiet recognition that this connection was no longer just fleeting. That evening marked a turning point. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface now had a voice, a playful, intimate acknowledgement of what we felt, delicately balanced on the edge of propriety. And though we both understood the boundaries, we had discovered something far more potent, the profound, quiet joy of being closer than ever, in both body and heart. The days after that quiet, golden evening carried a new rhythm between us, one measured, attentive, and infinitely more aware. There were no overt declarations, no dramatic gestures. Instead, the tension had softened into something warmer, gentler, and deeply human, an understanding that our connection was real, meaningful, and yet required care. We met in the office as usual, but now there was a subtle intimacy in our interactions. When I handed her a report, our fingers would brush lightly, intentionally lingering, accompanied by a quiet smile. When she asked a question, she leaned in slightly, not out of necessity, but out of the comfort of closeness. Every glance, every gesture was layered with meaning, unspoken yet understood. It was during one of these quieter moments that we finally spoke openly. We sat across from each other, papers set aside, and she exhaled softly, the tension in her shoulders slowly unwinding. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice low and steady, "about everything. About us. And about how complicated it all is." I nodded, feeling the weight of the moment, but also a sense of relief. "I've been thinking too," I admitted, my voice equally calm. "I don't want to cross lines that shouldn't be crossed, but I also can't ignore what's between us." Her eyes softened, reflecting a mix of vulnerability and quiet confidence. She reached across the desk, her fingers brushing mine lightly. The warmth of her touch was grounding, comforting, and carried the depth of understanding that words alone could not convey. "It's strange," she whispered. "I've never felt this connection with anyone before, not like this." I felt the same. The age difference, the social expectations, the hierarchy between us, they all mattered in theory, but in this space, with her, they faded. What remained was human, simple, and profound. Trust, empathy, and a slow-growing affection that neither of us wanted to deny. We spent the next few minutes sharing small, quiet confessions, the things that weighed on our minds, the fleeting fears we kept hidden, the vulnerabilities that made us human. Every word, every glance, every gentle touch across the desk deepened the bond between us. Her hand lingered on mine, light but deliberate, and I felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat beneath my fingers. By the end of the conversation, there was a sense of clarity. We hadn't crossed into a forbidden territory recklessly, nor had we resolved all complications, but we had acknowledged the truth of our feelings and the respect we owed each other. The tension that once simmered unspoken had transformed into a warm, shared understanding, a slow-burning intimacy that promised patience, care, and connection. As she stood to leave, our hands brushed again, longer this time, a silent promise of presence, attention, and respect. Her smile was soft, confident, yet tinged with vulnerability. I realized that the story between us wasn't about dramatic declarations or sudden passion. It was about shared moments, quiet honesty, and the steady, patient building of something rare and meaningful. That evening, I returned to my desk feeling a profound calm. The spark of attraction remained, but it was tempered with understanding, restraint, and emotional depth. We were closer than ever, not just physically, but in heart and mind, ready to explore the connection slowly, carefully, and fully. The following week felt different, though nothing had changed outwardly. The office still buzzed with the same routines, the same muted clatter of keyboards, the same polite conversations. Yet, beneath it all, there was a quiet, unspoken rhythm between us, a familiarity born of trust, honesty, and the subtle intimacy we had carefully nurtured. Each glance, each fleeting touch, carried a meaning that no one else could perceive, and that awareness made every moment we shared feel more alive. That evening, we found ourselves once again alone in her home office, sorting through papers and tidying files. She moved around the space with that same effortless grace, but there was a softness in her demeanor now, a slight relaxation in her shoulders, a gentle warmth in her smile. I noticed how her fingers lingered on the edge of the desk, the faint curve of her hand brushing mine, and the steady, reassuring rhythm of her presence. "I feel at ease with you," she said softly, as if confessing something she had only dared to feel in the quiet moments. There was no pressure in her tone, only honesty. "It's strange, considering everything, but it's true." I smiled, a warmth spreading through my chest. "I feel the same," I admitted, reaching lightly for her hand, letting my fingers rest against hers. The contact was tender, grounding, full of meaning without needing words. Her hand was warm, and her skin carried the subtle scent of the faint perfume she always wore, a delicate, comforting presence that lingered long after she withdrew. We spoke then of the days ahead, of boundaries, responsibilities, and the careful balance we would maintain. There was no need for dramatic declarations. Our connection was already understood, already cherished. We simply existed in the shared space, letting the quiet intimacy speak for itself. She leaned slightly closer while explaining a minor detail about a folder, and I felt the soft brush of her arm against mine. A small, private thrill ran through me, a reminder that closeness could exist even in the simplest gestures. Before leaving, she paused in the doorway, turning toward me with a small, almost shy smile. Her fingers lightly grazed mine one last time, a fleeting touch that conveyed warmth, trust, and the steady reassurance of connection. "See you tomorrow," she said softly, her voice carrying the quiet promise of continuity and shared understanding. I watched her leave, the room suddenly quieter, but not empty. Her presence lingered in the air, the warmth of her touch, the echo of her laughter, the subtle weight of the bond we had built. And in that quiet, I realized something essential. Our story wasn't about rushing, about crossing boundaries recklessly, or about dramatic climaxes. It was about the gentle accumulation of moments, the steady growth of trust, and the patient unfolding of something rare and meaningful. As I returned to my own space, I felt a profound sense of peace. We were closer than ever, not just in physical proximity, but in heart and mind. The age difference, the social expectations, the professional hierarchy, they were merely background to the warmth, respect, and intimacy that defined our connection. And in that quiet acknowledgement, the story reached its natural, satisfying conclusion, a slow-burning, deeply human romance that was steady, enduring, and beautifully ours.